So then I'm just going to go ahead and introduce the panelists. So we're going to start off with Amber.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. My name is Amber. I was an ALT in NARA from 2016 to 2019. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Originally from Chicago, but right now I'm living close to Nashville, Tennessee.
And all right, then we're going to move to Zara.
Well, it's me again. We all know my name is Zara Espinoza, and though my government name is Lara, I got the nickname Zara because in Japan, L and R is the same letter, and most of the time when you're an ALT or CIR, people call you by your first name, Sensei, but I got them to call me Estupinoza Sensei. My pronouns again are they, she, and they, zer. I am currently located in Chicago, or I'm typically located in Chicago, but I am currently located right now on the East Coast. So happy to be here. I was a ALT in Shiga Prefecture, which over here is my background right now. This is Hikonyan, our mascot of Shiga Prefecture, the biggest freshwater lake. I am also not just a senior advisor to JETAA Chicago, I am one of the United States of America country reps. So the cool thing about the JET program, it's about 34 years old and you have this big network. So I am one of the national representatives of the Alumni Association of the JET program. So lots of great things to look forward to. And also you all have a great support network that you're all coming into or are part of now. Thank you.
All right, and Andrew.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andrew. I'm a former JET. I was an ALT in Ishikawa Prefecture from 2014 to 2018. I'm originally from Chicago and I moved back after Japan, so I'm here in Chicago now. I also work for the Consulate General of Japan in Chicago. So some of you might have seen me there if you had interviews in Chicago. And I was also prefectural advisor for my prefecture. So if you have any questions about the inner workings of the JET program, I'll tell you what I can if I'm allowed to.
All right, last but not least, we have Gabrielle.
Hi, everyone. My name's Gabrielle. Gabby's also fine. I use she, her pronouns. I was an ALT in Tokyo from 2017 to 2019, in West Tokyo, actually, so not metropolitan Tokyo. And yeah, I currently live in Indiana. I'm leaving soon, though, trying to get to DC. And I am a diversity inclusion consultant for EY.
Okay, thank you for those lovely introductions. So to start off the panel, we can just go around in like the order that I introduced you all in and just talk about your experience in Japan and how that really affected you and how you navigated difficult situations. And then after that, we had our outgoing JET submit some questions, and then we're just gonna go down the line and have you all answer those questions. And if we do have more time after that, everybody feel free to submit questions in the chat. If you're not comfortable having your question like out where everybody can read it, feel free to just private message me your question. All right, so Amber.
All right. So overall, I think that my experience was pretty positive, but there were definitely some bittersweet moments as far as diversity and inclusion is concerned, because being a person of color, because as a foreigner, you're already a minority in Japan, but being a person of color, there were a lot of stereotypes that people have because a lot of people aren't exposed to people of color from other countries in Japan. So going in, a lot of times there were people who they thought I was either from Africa or did not speak English or assumed that I liked reggae, a lot of things like that. A lot of times, some of the students, I taught high school, but every now and then I would visit elementary school and some of the elementary students would ask like, oh, is your skin brown because you've never taken a bath before? And I was just like, oh, no. Even when I first went to Japan, my hair was braided. And for the first 3 months, I took it down and went to my high school and went in the teacher's room, like with it down in an afro for the first time. I kid you all not, my supervisor came up to me and asked me, are you Amber? So there's a lot of stuff like that that you deal with, but at the same time, people are also very curious and they want to get to know more about you as well. So even though some people have stereotypes, some people are also, wanting to learn more, wanting to like get to know you, get to know more about your culture as well. So there are pros and cons, but overall, it was a positive experience. Some funny tidbits.
I guess I think I'm next. So thank you, Amber. So for me, a little background on my identity intersections. And what I mean by identity intersections is I'm referring to the term coined by the critical race theorist, Kimberly Crenshaw. Look her up, Google, it's free. She coined the term intersectionality. I think the simplest way I can define it is how different parts of your identity overlap and impact each other, but it's not just, oh, your race and your gender, but it also could be your economic status. It's all areas that are typically historically, and it was typically used in reference to experiences of Black women that impact each other from like oppression and discrimination. But I think intersectionality is a term that's evolving over time, that we shouldn't forget its original meaning. But my identity intersections. So I was very frank in my statement of purpose when I applied for JET that I am biologically Korean and Japanese, but I was adopted and raised by a Mexican father and a white mother, so a Mexican American family. And so I have a slight accent. My last name's Espinoza. I'm not Filipino. And I grew up in a really tiny town in Michigan with no stoplight. And so I really put in my statement of purpose that, I am the embodiment of America, just with all the diversity and the melting pot America claims that it is. And though I look Japanese-ish, I'm far from it. Don't know, never knew anything about it other than studying it in school. When I went to Japan on the JET program, none of my Japanese friends or anyone warned me that this would be the first time that I'm a majority in the country, because I never thought of myself as Japanese, though I am biologically Japanese. So I just remember typically when it's not COVID times, you would go to Tokyo for the first few days in the JET program and do this big orientation. I remember getting on the train and hyperventilating because it was hot. It's going to be really hot when you get to Japan if you go in the summer, but I think y'all go in the fall. It's a little calmer then. And freaking out because to me, I was like, I'm surrounded by so many Asian people. I wasn't used to it. It freaked me out. And then my friend had to tell me, sorry, you're Asian. And I'm like, no, I'm not a Mexican. And so I had to keep telling myself who I was and also allowing that to evolve over time, because never before did I, even in my home country here in America, because I've been here since I was like 3 months old, I never felt American. The model minority myth of being Asian American, I always am the perpetual foreigner, but in Japan, I was the majority for the first time in my life, but I didn't feel Japanese at all. Like I didn't know any of the unspoken rules about women making the tea when I'm like, I'm making no one's tea but my own. And also like, for me as well, like never before did I feel more American than when I was abroad, which was weird because everyone would tell me I'm not American, but then everyone in Japan tells me I'm American, because for me, I didn't just get the culture shock or model minority stuff or just being a minority in general in Japan. Because as Amber said, when you're a foreigner, you're already a minority, including white people. To me, it was like, oh my gosh, like I also got culture shock, not just from Japanese people, but from my foreign constituents, other jets from around the world, over 50 different countries, meeting people that didn't think America was so great, which, it's good to decenter yourself and learn different perspectives from all the world. So that was probably like my biggest takeaway from the JET program. But for me, I had to always tell people who I was instead of having them tell me who I am. And it was just kind of a mind F in the sense I'm like, here are people for the first time in my life who look like me, telling me what I am, but yet I match none of it. And so it was a big part of my identity, along with that I am gay, I'm queer. And so I wasn't out in Japan, but I was out only when I was at the clubs and stuff, just because that was a safe place to be out and gay and who you are in Japan. And also Japanese people look at queer people differently and queers practice differently in Japan. And so all those intersections, and also I identify as non-binary. So I never fit the typical mold of a woman, because in my opinion, most of the time in Japan, they will see your gender first, in my experience, not just your race. So that's just a snapshot there. I always have to keep telling myself, though we are minorities in Japan as the foreigners, like POCs are the majority. And I also had to develop a different type of empathy to support my white colleagues too, who are experiencing being a minority for the first time and realizing, wow, I feel for you, but I don't feel sorry for you, because the type of staring and people wanting to touch your hair is everything I go through in my own home country. So it was a big exercise all around for us, but I'll pause there.
Andrew, I think you're next.
Alrighty, sorry, I haven't. All right. So yeah, thank you for that, Zara. I just want to echo those last few sentiments for my fellow white incoming Jets. This might be the first time, if you spent your entire life in the U.S., that you are going to be visibly other. So I would encourage you to be ready for that and to keep in mind what Zara said, and try to remember that if you come back to your home country, and you try and carry that with you, and try to always remember the experiences you have in Japan as you move forward, because those can be some really powerful learning experiences for you. But anyway, so my name is, as I said, Andrew, and I am going to be sharing any kind of information or answering questions that any of you might have about the experience as a queer person in Japan. I have experiences being a Jet, both in the closet and out of the closet. I spent the first 2 years predominantly in the closet. I was teaching mostly elementary school students, and the advice I received for the most part was to stay in the closet, not to mention sexuality, which again, for elementary school students, was not really something that came up very much in the first place. Your romantic life is considered pretty private in general. So even, heteronormative relationships are not really talked about or discussed, or really public displays of affection are not a really big thing in Japan. So truthfully, it can be, in terms of your sexuality, things can be you can stay in the closet pretty easily. But when I switched to teaching high school, I encountered some students at my schools who were out. I had a student in my English club who identified as gay, and I became sort of a mentor for him. And I experienced at a different school a student who was gay who committed suicide, and that was it was a real turning point for me, because I realized that my presence as an out gay person could make a real difference in the lives of my students and the lives of my coworkers. So the final 2 years of my time on Jet, I was out to my students and to my coworkers where appropriate. Again, I didn't really discuss my sexuality with elementary schoolers, but I can answer questions about being a Jet both in the closet and out of the closet. I can talk a little bit about trying to find queer community in your area, and if there is none, the experience I had with creating that kind of community. One thing I can say is that even if you have a hard time initially finding a queer community in Japan, I can almost guarantee you that you'll be able to find some within your fellow Jet community. Queer people tend to be overrepresented in fields related to linguistics and language and education. So there will be a lot of us out there, and you will encounter a vast array of people and perspectives. And I would say you'll be able to find your community some way, somehow, if you put in the effort and you go out and look for it. So if you have any other more specific questions, I'm always happy to talk more about any of the specifics of that, talking about what queer culture looks like in Japan, talking about different facets of queer life and queer acceptance in Japan. Obviously, my experiences as a cisgender white gay man, but I do have some experience working or advocating for working with lesbian Jets. We had a transgender man in my prefecture for 1 year, so I have some experience sort of advocating for transgender Jets in the area, and I'm happy to share the experiences that I have. And also, kind of, if you have any questions about like the more the government side, I was the liaison between the Board of Education and Jets, so I do have some experience, and like I can offer any kind of advice if you have questions about that as well.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone. Kind of set the stage. I had to take some notes because I'm like, wow, I shouldn't. Everyone's saying good stuff. So I had a really unique experience, mainly because I was in Tokyo, and I think now that the Olympics are ending, I think they're going to kind of scale back Tokyo Jet slowly again over the years, because I think starting in 2015 they started bringing cohorts over because of the Olympics. And so I was really fortunate to be in one of those cohorts to Tokyo. And so, yeah, my experience was really unique because of that. I think I had a lot of privilege in my JET experience, even though I identify as being a Black woman, cisgender woman here in the States. And with that, I don't always have a lot of privilege, but I had a lot of privilege in my experience. So I was in the suburbs of Tokyo, but I was like an hour away from like Shinjuku and all the crazy stuff. And so it was a really wealthy community. So a lot of just the community I was in was really nice. It was really, and we know Japan in general is safe, clean, all of that, but it was like a really nice place where I was. And so I was at a top 5 school in Tokyo. So a lot of my students, I had 12 colleagues. They were all fluent in English. There was no one I had difficulty speaking with. My students were all pretty much high level learners. They all would go on to like Tokyo University or some of the other big schools. So um, it was just there wasn't much difference from my home life. And I'm a educator by training. I've just recently transitioned to the private sector, but it didn't feel like I made a big crazy transition in terms of that. So the colleagues and my students were very, very progressive, very open-minded. They gave me a big platform to talk about a lot of this stuff. During February, I would do Black History Month lessons, and there were a lot of movements going on, at least in Tokyo at that time. There was a journalist who kind of spurned Japan's version of the Me Too movement, and we talked about that in class. So I was in a very, very progressive environment, very supportive environment. Anything I wanted to kind of talk about that I thought was a global issue, I could talk about. So just very lucky in that way. And I didn't speak Japanese. I didn't really, going on to JET and being interested in Japan was a very like suddenly came out of nowhere. Well, there's a long story behind it, but I won't get into that. But was not something that I'd been interested in for a really long time, or even knew about JET for a long time. It was something that kind of came about within a year to 2 years, and it so happened to work out for me. So I was really grateful. But didn't speak any Japanese, barely knew anything about Japan, but really had supportive people around me. And I was able, because I was in Tokyo, to find majority foreigner spaces. So I could go out and find hip hop clubs where there's lots of Black people. And actually most of my network was Black folks, and I could count on my hand how many of them were Black Americans. They were from Africa, they were from UK, they were from the Caribbean. So it was still very diverse in that Blackness is not a monolith, right? But I still could find my community. I didn't have to stretch really to get out of my comfort zone. And my colleagues themselves were just so amazing. I was at people's houses having dinners. We went on trips together. So I found both insider and outsider community while I was there. Just very, very lucky. But with that, I was kind of placed on a pedestal to be a spokesperson for Americanness or Blackness or foreignness, and had to have some tough conversations with that. I think in 2018, the National New Year's program had blackface performance, and just having to like explain why that's bad or why that's hurtful. And so just being in some of those conversations was really a great learning opportunity for me, but also being able to impart that knowledge. I also had a normative body type in Japan, so a lot of privilege with that, and that could still find clothes easily. And you hear kind of really challenging stories sometimes of kind of the scrutiny and discrimination that folks who don't fit that normative body type face. It can be kind of, I think one of the things we do, there's fat phobia in America, right? But we're less overt with it. But like Japanese people will straight up say things to you that can be very, very hurtful. So again, so fortunate I did not experience that, but heard that or about that from friends. And I also was involved. There's tons of Facebook groups that you can join and find that support and community. And so I actually there's a Black Women in Japan group. And so, yeah, it was a great experience, but also heard stories of those challenging times, and but don't regret a second of it.
Okay, thank you for that. So for our first question we have, I'm also going to put it in the chat. So if you all want to read it later, is I am learning Japanese and am nervous about how people will react to me speaking it as a second language, especially since it is not perfect. How can I interact when I have this language barrier? For example, word choice and formality level, just making friends and not being alone. So feel free to speak whenever you have.
I'm going to go first just because I didn't really have to learn Japanese, but there were times I had to. And so just what worked best for me is like, it's fine to make mistakes. And, but taking that time to study is really important. But I think it's important to know, I don't know if this person can maybe share if they're going to be rural or suburban, because that makes all the difference really. Um, but I would just say like, give yourself grace, study as much as you can. It's okay to make mistakes. Mistakes are how you learn, especially if like people correct you or it doesn't get across, then you'll know you need to kind of improve whatever that is. But that's all I have because I learned it while I was there, right? Just by being there, but I didn't have to learn it. So this is always the part where I feel like I can't contribute that much.
I'm going to just jump in a bit too. So while it's not my personal experience, because I actually speak the language pretty well, something that I would recommend, definitely like using apps and finding ways to meet up with people who are also interested in learning English is a good way to make Japanese friends who are willing to like not only practice with you and do that language exchange, but also like show you around and like, you know, let you see a whole nother avenue of the country that you wouldn't see if you didn't have those friends. So definitely doing things like Meetup is a really good one. Hello Talk, because you'll be in the country, so you'll be able to actually meet those people that you're talking to, and like just finding local events or anything like that for just meeting other people who probably have that English ability or are interested in other cultures. So they're not gonna, it'll be easier to connect with them and you guys will be able to communicate a bit easier.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that, when I first arrived in Japan, I did not have any real formal study of the language. I had, been on Duolingo and learned some like survival Japanese, but that was about it. I spent a lot of time studying while I was there, but for the first, year or so, my experience in Japan was one with very limited Japanese. And one thing I can say to assuage any worries is that Japanese people are some of the most hospitable people in the world. And I think I never encountered any kind of sort of attitude where people were annoyed or frustrated with my lack of ability. It was always trying to go above and beyond with gestures or the limited English that they knew to try and really communicate. And if you just stay calm and try and smile and be as friendly and patient as possible, Japanese people will go above and beyond to help you, to communicate with you. Um, and they are so encouraging. You'll be surprised if you can speak 2 or 3 words. You will be praised for your Japanese ability. It becomes kind of humorous, but I think the important thing is I try to always turn a negative into a positive. So I turned my lack of Japanese ability into a way to meet other people. So I made sure that I was taking classes in Japanese at the local community center, which also introduced me to other fun activities, other fun people in the area. I know my co-ALT, she volunteered and she did conversation classes with retired English teachers who were interested in like sort of keeping up and practicing. So that was a way for her to meet other people in her neighborhood and get to know others. So I think that no one is going to expect you to speak fluent, sparkling, perfect Japanese if you are visibly foreign. Zara, I would be interested to hear your experience as somebody who might be confused for, a Japanese person born and raised in Japan. But if you are a foreigner, you're going to get a lot of leeway, you're going to get a lot of grace, and you're going to get a lot of patience thrown your way. But my advice is just kind of just use that as a way to connect with other people and sort of turn that negative into a positive.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and also Amber and Gabrielle for, sharing your experiences with Andrew. I really appreciate you acknowledging that the Asian American experience and or someone who doesn't visibly look foreign in Japan, it's very different. Another thing, I'm just so honored to be on this panel because each one of my fellow speakers I helped send out to Japan. So I am 10 years returned. So back in 2010, there was barely any smartphones in Japan. So this is just to kind of put things in perspective for the outgoing Jets. And so I went there when the iPhone was just coming out. SoftBank, which is a phone company there, was the only one to have the iPhone 3S and the 4. There was no Android phones, no nothing. And so there, social media, I think, and the internet has really maybe brought more perspective or just exposure to things to Japan, especially foreigners and different cultures. But that wasn't a thing when I was there 10 years ago. And so with that, like, yes, everything that they said is true. And I'm sure you outgoing just have heard the JET acronym of ESID. Every situation is different. Well, put a P at the S, is every person's different. Andrew is right. When you don't visibly look foreign, just like imagine, like, there's a lot of people in America of like German or mixed white European descent. Like imagine if you were from a small town and a white cisgender looking man came and he couldn't speak any English. He never saw English before. And people probably wouldn't be too patient with him, right? Well, I experienced that in Japan because I was in a more rural area. I didn't even have a main train line. And I had no Japanese ability. I could barely read hiragana and katakana. I do recommend, if you are similar to me, to try and just make some flashcards and get those, because then you can sound out things, especially foreign words. And maybe if like you have a dietary restriction, like I can't eat meat or I can't eat fish or something like that, learn the kanji for those. But with having no language ability, but looking and they could smell, I swear, the Japanese blood in me, I got asked a lot if I had a mental disability. I got asked a lot if I was stupid. They thought I was like mixed race, which mixed race people in Japan aren't usually favored unless you're Naomi Osaka. But even then, Naomi Osaka is mainly favored because she's a tennis star and lighter skinned. So as much as Japan can be this wonderful wonderland of very accepting, like they're all right, very polite people. So I follow everyone's leader. Like if you try and you're polite and you're patient and you talk really slow, like English, most Japanese people, and if you're also forgiving for them, because a lot of them are usually very scared to try their English skills with you, because speaking English is not taught a lot in the Japanese English speaking curriculum. It's mainly writing. So yeah, patience, politeness goes a long way. But with my Japanese friends, when they would meet a visibly foreign person, would be very worried about saving face, if you know what that means. Like they'd be like, oh, I don't want to embarrass myself publicly by having bad English. So they would, run away from the foreigner, and they would come up to me and start speaking Japanese at me, and they're scared. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're saying. And they're like, Jozuego, which means your English is really good. I'm like, I am a foreigner. And back then I would get a foreigner card. I'm like, I am a foreigner. And I just remember a Japanese person taking the card out of my hand, looking at it, bending it to see if it was a fake ID, and then throwing it. And I'm like, no, that's mine. Like that's my legal ID. And I just remember getting a lot of, I don't like using this term, but this is the best thing I can think, like almost like reverse. Like, I'm like, wow, I thought I would finally meet people who look like me and who would be accepting of me. And they weren't, like, because they expected me to be something I wasn't. And it took a while for me putting myself out there, just like what Andrew, Gabby, and Amber said, to find those people who believed me. And I mean, that can happen here too in America, but also the foreigner community wasn't very supportive at times, because they got like, you've heard all three of the speakers say like, oh, I met Japanese friends, they were really friendly to me. A lot of people assumed, because I have of Japanese descent, that I had Japanese family already in Japan. So I never was invited anywhere. So just putting in perspective that as much as you're all in this together to some extent, and in a similar boat, being all Jets and foreigners, everyone is having a very different experience. And also, like, I had to send back money. People thought it was weird when I was asking these questions, because everyone assumed, oh, you're a foreigner, foreigners have money. And I'm like, huh? Like, just a lot of assumptions of different intersections of my identity that got assumed on me. And it's something that I faced here in America. But the whole new thing was, wow, I can't use my language. Language is taken from me. And also, these people look like me, but I'm nothing like them. So like Amber said, and also Andrew, I used a lot of gestures, and I was open-minded, and I just kept staying true to who I was. I didn't shove it in people's faces. I remained flexible, but I was very much like, when people would be like Japanese, and I'm like, American, and they're like Japanese. We go back and forth for a while, but I'm like, I'm American. And I also, as much as I wanted to practice my Japanese, I didn't use everyone, like especially my students, I didn't use them to practice my Japanese. Like, because people would look at people like Gabby and Andrew and Amber and be like, oh, it's my English chance. I can practice my English. And I would hear my fellow foreign friends who are of Asian descent being like, oh, they only want to speak English to me, but I got the weird privilege of like, they only want to speak Japanese to me. So my Japanese got a tinge better, but I had to remind myself that I'm there first to be a jet and to be a foreign ambassador. And so I very much like exercise, not just my English, because English is just a tool, but just introducing them to Mexican culture. They thought fajitas were Mexican sushi because they saw me roll in a tortilla, and just kept sharing who I was without like smacking it in their face, but also having the perseverance and the tough skin to stay who I was, but evolve to something further despite the hardships that I had. And I don't know if there's any people on this call that identify as Asian or have Asian descent in them, but I think it's important for everyone to know these types of experience, because I guarantee you'll meet people of Asian descent who don't, you know, who are foreigners as well. And it's empathy is always a great thing to have. It really brings communities together and takes them to the next level.
All right, thank you for that heavy stuff, but no, that's very important. Thank you all. So for our next question, it's pretty long. If a Japanese student comes to you with questions about their identity or sexuality, how do you handle it? Are we allowed to discuss with students? Will we have resources to share with them? In other words, how can we support the student?
So I can start off if you don't mind. I would say you're going to get so tired of hearing this, but it is a little bit of an ESID. Every sushi is delicious. No, every situation is different. It will depend a lot on your individual school. And I think, so I know in my prefecture, we were considered a more rural and conservative prefecture, but I know even in my area, when I was in my final year there, they were sort of revamping the sort of sex ed to include more information about alternative sexualities and gender identities. I know there was sort of mandatory training for teachers for supporting queer students or gender non-binary students or transgender students. So I think that it can be tricky in terms of what the official course of action is for teachers. The school may have a policy, they might have absolutely nothing written. If you're curious, I think it's always okay to ask. And generally, if you ask around in the staff room, talk to your supervisor, they will be able to point you in the direction of any kind of official guidelines. But I would say as an ALT, you tend to not have the same kind of responsibility towards your students that an actual homeroom teacher would. So I think that the official responsibility for those students lies with their homeroom teachers and the staff at the school. That said, I think that we're obviously allowed to be an important support system for the students. I know I mentioned earlier in my introduction, when I was teaching high school, one of my English club students came out to me, and I also knew of a student at a different high school whose ALT introduced him to me because she told me that he had come out to her as gay, and she wanted to try and get him in touch with other people because, as far as he knew, there were no other gay people, you know, in the area in his town. So I think that we are, like, even if you don't yourself identify as somebody who's queer, being somebody who is an ally is a really important is really, really important. And again, because sexuality in general tends to be kind of kept behind closed doors in Japan, and because any kind of alternative sexuality or gender identity is not necessarily seen as wrong or sinful or shameful in Japan, but because it does fall under the general umbrella of different, which is often just kind of swept under the rug or encouraged to stay hidden, it can be a very isolating or lonely experience for your students. So I think if someone does come to you with questions about their identity or sexuality, the best thing that you can do is just try to encourage them to remember that you support them no matter what, to remind them that, you know, maybe where I come from, that's very normal. There are a lot of people who identify the same way. If you do know anybody in your community, you can point them out as an example. And if you feel comfortable, or if you know that they have been speaking with, their homeroom teacher, that's usually the person that sort of is a parental figure to them. You can maybe discuss that with their homeroom teacher with the help of your supervisor if that teacher doesn't necessarily speak English. And I would say otherwise, that student is obviously speaking to you in confidence, so I wouldn't go like blabbing about that in the staff room. The obvious exception would be if you feel the student is in immediate, physical harm. But otherwise, I would say as foreigners, we automatically don't fit the mold and we automatically stand out. So I think that sometimes that is attractive to Japanese students who also feel that they don't fit the mold, that they don't fit in, and that they stand out. And so I think one of the most powerful things that you can do to support queer students is to, if you are queer yourself and you feel comfortable to share your story and show them they're not alone. But even if you aren't, to be an active ally and to try to make known the best you can that you accept and support them no matter what. That would be my advice.
Yeah, I wanted to also plug everything Andrew said, and I also wanted to plug. So so another great thing. So JETAA, the Jet Alumni Association, was descendant from AJET, so the Association of Jet. So the Association of Jet is all volunteer as well. It's if you haven't joined National AJET or you have in your own block, so in your own regions, an AJET chapter kind of runs like a JETAA. But it's of current jets in Japan, but they decided to be a bit more inclusive when they made the Stonewall Stonewall organization of it, and it's all LGBTQ and allies, so even non-identifying but supporters community. It used to be called Stonewall AJET, so you may have heard it there, but now it's called Stonewall Japan. So you'll meet people not just who are fellow Jets, it's predominantly that, but you meet people from all over Japan, from other English teaching franchises or companies, and or even just queer people in Japan. It's really become such a mecca and a great resource. They even have like HRT resources on there, hormone treatment stuff for like trans identifying people. But like Andrew said, like even for me, like I think even in America, because I also work in the diversity, equity, inclusion sector, is like, PDA and sexuality is just very different in Japan, but something remains so is you don't talk about it at work. But like Andrew said, as the foreigner, you're already weird and you stick out. So people might think they have a right to ask you about these things, including the students, even if it's a student who identifies as so. And you may be like, let's talk about it later. And a lot of the students who came to me, especially female students, because they're like, you're so suyoi, like you're so strong. But what they meant was I was really masculine, and that I never wore pink, and that I didn't cross my legs when I sat down, and I was always in pants. And I also I drank like a man and all this other stuff. And so, the thing is I lived out loud with who I was, though I wasn't like out queer wise there, but I lived in myself, not unapologetically me, but strongly who I was, but enough where I was taking in other cultures. So being that example, like Andrew said, is so important. But I do also want to say, to add to what he had said too, if you are not queer identifying, allyship is not a badge you wear. It is a verb and is something you constantly do. And allyship doesn't just mean to people who are queer. It's anyone who is different, especially in the Jet community, because you're always different when you're there. It doesn't matter how much Japanese you speak. It doesn't matter if you have a Japanese spouse or partner, or if you've been to Japan to study 100 times, or even like me, if you're of Japanese blood, you're never going to be Japanese. So with that, like, it doesn't matter if you're like, oh, I've been here and I'm out and gay and I can say this. Like, no, you are a guest in that country. You have chosen to be there. You have different privileges. So like Andrew said, like, use your gut. You were hired for a reason because we want you. So be you, use your best judgment, and always just take it slower, ask questions, and respect boundaries, and set your own.
Thank you for that. Okay, for our next question, it's also a very long one. What were some strategies that you used to address cultural misunderstandings or behavior that would be considered disrespectful abroad? For example, the blackface, especially considering the importance of saving face in Japanese culture, what would be a productive way to have these kinds of conversations when they come up without being culturally insensitive yourself?
That's a really great question. So I'm just going to start it off with something that I experienced while being in the elementary schools. A lot of times people would come up to me and the little kids would come and touch my hair without my permission or like just start grabbing. And I would just kind of calmly explain to them and often have the homeroom teacher as well give them an explanation too of how that can be seen as kind of offensive if you do that without someone's permission and giving them an understanding of why so that they can use that going forward like, oh, I shouldn't just, treat someone like an object just because they're different. Like this person is a person too. They have feelings just like me, even though they look different. Just giving them that understanding. I didn't have that problem with the high schoolers so much because they were older, but with younger people and people, I guess, without that exposure, just giving them that kind explanation, I think is pretty helpful. But I want to hear what the rest of you have to say as well.
I think it depends on the situation and depends on like what you expect the outcome to be. So if it's like a situational thing that happens once, you're going to be a foreigner there, right? So things are going to happen. We have to think about and have empathy for all the different people in America who experience discrimination and prejudice every day. And it's really eye-opening that way, in that microaggressions are just like fleeting things that might happen, but you can't really change them, control them, if it's just like a one-off kind of thing, right? But if there's things that are happening over and over, that requires like further conversation. Um, the conversation I had at my school about the blackface incident, that was a national news program, so it didn't relate to my job, but I was actually kind of like elevated as a Black person, as a foreigner, to speak to it. So you kind of have to express your bandwidth around doing that kind of work. Again, this is like what I'm trained in, what in my work, so totally comfortable with doing that. But you should not feel like you should be a spokesperson for your race, your identity, your country, any parts of your identity. If you can set those boundaries, and that just your supervisor should be your first point of contact for a lot of this stuff, right? So um, kind of expressing what you are comfortable talking about, sharing that kind of stuff. And then if something does happen, kind of pulling them to the side and expressing, this happened to me, it made me feel this way. And if you can kind of draw any parallels to something that if they were to experience that, how it would make them feel. But just really humanizing the interactions. It's going to take, there was a lot of things I kind of let roll off my back, right? If it wasn't going to harm me, cause me any harm, or that Japan is now, when I am talking about the time I spent working in Japan, I explain it that Japan is light years ahead of us in a lot of ways, but light years behind us in terms of globalization and just like cultural understanding. So you kind of have to go in there anticipating and accepting some of the ignorance, right? Because it's a 99% homogenous society that was closed off up until only, what, 200 years ago, something like that, 250 years ago. So a lot of patience, a lot of empathy, choose your battles. But yeah, if it's gonna cause harm for you, if you feel like you're being harmed or you're being, threatened, if it's something perpetual, definitely talk to your supervisor first. Reach out to older JETs, older meaning like they've been there longer, and just pick your battles. But be firm in your boundaries and your expectations.
Yeah, I'm just gonna echo quick from what Gabby said about like, yeah, pick your battles. And with that too, like she put it in a great perspective of, you're a foreigner there. And yes, you will, so many JETs I meet want to change the world right away. My 10 years of being in there, and you need to keep that spirit, like that gombare, that I want to change the world, and you will. But the world may be one student that never could speak English well and never wanted to go abroad because, for me, even like I thought, because I only knew Japan to the people that I knew that chose from Japan to come to America. But those are the people that wanted to come to America. They wanted to leave Japan. You hear about a lot of the people who never want to leave America. They think America is the best country in the world, and there's a lot of ignorance and arrogance. Well, those people also exist in Japan. And they never want to leave Japan. They think Japan is the best country in the world and all stuff. That's in every country, right? And so like always try to as I said, the big, like Jet gave me superpowers, and it can give you superpowers too if you choose to let it. But the superpower manifests, I'm a big superhero person, obviously, manifests in you in different ways, depending on your situation and depending on how you use it. Like for me, one of my biggest superpowers I gained from Jet is my ability to adapt, not just in situations like in the classroom, my ability to adapt myself, to decenter myself. I almost had to have I'm glad I didn't experience blackface, but I did experience a lot of people assuming that my father, who is because colorism is real, a very dark skinned Mexican man. And I was over there when President Obama was in his second term. And so everyone assumed that my dad was Black. And they also saw my skin tone, and I was very tan from the summer. And women are not supposed to be dark if they're older. They're supposed to be like Snow White and bleach their face, that they called me Black. And to me, as much as like, okay, that didn't bother me too much, I had to decenter myself and think of how, if I let them do this to me, what will they do when like Amber or Gabby come to Japan? And so I picked and chose my battles, and I'm like, I'm not Black. Black, when you say Black, as in I'm darker skinned, just say I'm darker skinned. Like, you know, I would choose to be a teacher and when not to be, especially if it was after hours of my work. But also I decentered myself. Sometimes I had to decenter the country from me. Like sometimes the only way I could deal with Japan was being like, oh, Japan. Because remember, you're choosing to be there. You're not born into it. And so, you know, again, I got that superpower of not just decentering myself, which has really helped me pick my battles in my professional and personal life now, but also, you know, putting things into perspective. It's not that it's not so bad. Like, don't minimize yourself or dismiss your feelings, but putting in perspective, like, wow, okay, if this is something I really can't stand, is this somewhere where I want to be for the rest of my life? Do I want to sign that next contract? Or maybe I will, because, you know, the economy is bad back home and I'm going to spend this whole next year, you know, since I'm good at my job right now and getting into grad school, like again, decentering yourself, picking your battles, adapting to the situations there and thinking about your impact. Like, again, that's, since I am the most senior Jet on this panel, like, I hope that the little things that I did, whether being myself or creating these little relationships and connections, help the three who came after me, who are on this panel with me. So remember, changing the world doesn't look like taking on everything. It could just be a little thing. So always remember, in Japanese, chotozutsu is one of my mantras, little by little.
I'll try to be brief. I would think that I really agree with what Zara said. Like, a lot of the change that we are here to make is going to be grassroots change, and that happens on a person-to-person level rather than institutional change. You, as an assistant language teacher in a public school, are not going to change the face of, you know, race relations in Japan or, you know, gender roles in Japan, but you can change some minds while you're there. And the best way to do that is with patience and with kindness and with humanity. And I think that another thing I'd really like to echo is what Gabrielle said about, you know, knowing what your boundaries are and also knowing what your limits are, and that you are not personally responsible for changing every mind while you're there. You know, if it's someone in the supermarket that you're never going to see again and you've had a long day and you're tired and you just want your Chuhai, like, you don't owe that person a course on, you know, on why what they did was offensive if it's not in you that day. So I think my advice is to know what your boundaries are and know what your limits are and know what your values are before you go into the country, so that when you are faced with a situation, you're able to make that choice in the moment, and a choice that's best for you and best for, you know, for the people of Japan. I think that, you know, discrimination in Japan tends to be less conscious and malicious and more born out of ignorance. It's more subtle, it's more systemic, which makes it harder to call out and harder to change. As someone who spent time, you know, trying to be the liaison between Jets and the government and advocating for them, I would say, from a pragmatic perspective, maybe not so much an idealistic one, but from a pragmatic perspective, my advice is tantrums and shouting and screaming will get you nowhere. If you lose your temper, if you lose your cool, you've already lost. And I think that the most effective strategy I have found when confronting this kind of problems with ALTs and CARs and other Jets is to appeal to the Japanese sense of omotenashi, which is hospitality. And, you know, when you say this is a microaggression, you know, it tends to, you know, it tends to be perceived as, oh, well, they do things differently in this person's country. We do things the Japanese way here. It's just a misunderstanding. But if you say, I don't feel welcome here when you do X, Y, Z to me, I don't want to go
I
home.
don't feel welcome in Japan when people say this to me.
Yeah,
This
exactly.
community doesn't feel welcoming.
Yes. And I don't want to go home thinking that Japanese people feel XYZ about me and people like me. I think is a much more effective means of communicating that discontent. So that's all I'll say to that.
Yeah, and that kind of passive aggressive, not very direct thing, that is not you, y'all. That is how Japanese like language is. It's very passive. And so English is very direct, but like that passivity in the Japanese language also goes to the culture. So even though you're like, why can't I just say like, you're hurting me, I don't feel welcome, like you got to kind of, again, be strategic in your language. So yeah, reflect it back at them.
Okay, thank you. For our next question, how can I set boundaries when it comes to me, my race, and identity without cutting myself off from those around me? I know social norms are different, but how different? What about microaggressions?
I would say either utilizing or pretending ignorance goes a long way. Um, Again, kind of what Andrew was saying, like kind of throwing it back on people if they ask you something really ignorant or place you in a position where you're not comfortable, or there's an assumption being made about your identity. You can kind of say, oh, I don't know, like what is that, and like make them explain, or then turn it back on them to explain. um, but I think your introductions are really key for kind of setting the tone for how you want to be addressed, what you're comfortable with. So your introductions you'll do to the Board of Education or to your school, to individual classes. That's when you can share like the parts of you that you are willing to share. And so you might still get questions after that, but if you really are clear about, this is how I view myself, this is what you can know about me, then that really sets the tone for how you want people to perceive you. Social norms, there are some things that can be very different, right? And again, it's based on rural versus suburban. Just the gender norms are so ingrained still. It's very crazy sometimes. And again, I was in Tokyo, so the metropolis of Japan, but there's still like, yeah, like not wearing fingernail polish at work, or expected to wear skirts or things like that. And again, just be willing and open to go with that. You are a guest in a country that has had these norms for a while. So unless it's causing you harm, unless it's like really taking you out of your comfort zone, be willing and open to kind of operate under some of those norms while you're there.
And yeah, like what Gabrielle said, like operating under these norms doesn't mean you agree with them. So know that you're not sacrificing yourself. Like all this is temporary, y'all. Even if you choose to stay in Japan after JET, your JET experience is temporary, but that's what makes it beautiful, right? But also JET is ever long. It's what you make of it, even after the program. Like I feel like my work in JETAA helped me have a better JET career because I didn't have the best time while I was on JET. It was really hard. And one of the ways that I dealt with microaggressions, because to me, I would love to find a word that didn't use microaggression because their impact is so big, right? And so for me, I always tried to, I guess, do micro resistance in the sense of, people would always tell me, like, I remember my first day of elementary school teaching, I was in elementary and junior high ALT. And this older man, I was sitting in the teacher's room and he was like, couldn't speak any English, came up to me and he started yelling at me. But I can understand, he said ocha, which means like tea in Japanese. And he just keeps pointing at me to go make the tea. That's a big gender norm, that the women make the tea. And I know I appear more femme, though I'm way more masculine. And I just didn't understand, but he just kept yelling at me. And so finally, like he like literally grabbed me by the arm and like led me to the tea kettle and pointed at it. And I'm like, oh, he wants me to make the tea. And I honestly couldn't read because my Japanese was so bad. Like, what was tea, what wasn't. And there was a bunch of plants next to the tea still, but there was apparently, instead of tea, I used a bag of soil to make the tea. I didn't know, I couldn't read, I was illiterate in Japan, and he never asked me to make the tea again. And so like that little like mishap ended up showing him that like, hey, like you can't just assume people know what to do. And even though I'm like foreign teacher, but yeah, I always had to check, like when I lived in Japan more than here, I've had to check in with myself constantly. And like, you know, kind of like again, like if anyone's seen like in superhero movies when like things are moving really fast to the point where they don't move at all, like kind of put yourself in that, like to slow yourself down and be like, do I want to deal with this right now? Can I be a teacher right now? Or can I just, you know, put my arrogance and ignorance back at them? You know, it's one of those things where assessing everything, taking it one day at a time and knowing that this is temporary. And, you know, for me, like Gabrielle was right about, you know, your Jiko Shokai, your introduction is where you can really shine. That's where you're supposed to, you know, tell everyone what you're about. And that Jiko Shokai can look different in your schools, at your work, and also with your friends. And it's also one of those things like try to share as much as possible, but know that sharing doesn't have to be unanimous across the board because it's exhausting, right? So, but the more you share, the more people can like, you know, grasp on the little things. Like I was a professional dancer during my time on JET. When I shared that, oh, I'm a dancer. I love dancing. I love hip hop dancing. It was when then I found my real community of Japanese professional hip hop dancers who spoke no English. Never had seen a foreigner that looked Japanese, but they became my family. It took 6 months, but they became my family. And it was because I put myself out there when I was able to. And in the weirdest way possible, I would just do like a little jig, you know, like this and that. I'm a dancer. And then people would eventually point me the way. So it's a lot of perseverance. I don't want to say resilience, but perseverance, a lot of checking in with myself, and a lot of just standing my ground firm, but keeping my knees supple, as in I can move and twist and bend and turn whenever I want. So that's probably my biggest advice for not cutting yourself short.
Okay, thank you for that. So for our next question, it might be our last question. We are running out of time, but I imagine in most cases, being a foreigner in Japan already makes a person stand out. Has anyone been insulted for wearing clothing that makes you stand out even more? Specific brands, sports apparel, etc. What about having a spouse or partner?
I'm gonna jump in really quickly about this one. So my clothing while being a teacher was never insulted, but you can't wear revealing clothing while in Japan, period, but especially not as a teacher. So usually I would try to wear a cardigan if I had a sleeveless dress on. And there were times when my students could see that it was a sleeveless dress, even though I had a cardigan on, and they'd be like, oh, sexy, sexy. No, 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 no. Outside of that, making sure that you're dressed appropriately for work, for sure, business casual in most cases. Yeah, but as long as you're dressed appropriately and not dressed in a way that's very like provocative or gaudy in your face, like you're pretty much okay. Yes, the you look cold definitely is a way of saying you are dressed very scantily, put more clothes on.
Yeah, I definitely took the approach of like grandma chic. That's kind of like what the style is like, I liked it though. It's comfortable. Like it's a change of pace from like, I think in American culture, women are expected to wear tighter fitting clothing or what have you. So the looser, the better, the less attention you'll get. And I would say, yeah, just keep it like business casual. Definitely. You will get looks and comments if it's outside of those bounds. So flashy colors or fabrics, or if you look too young, like if you look like you could be one of the students, like don't do that. But also bring your individuality. So I don't know if it's kind of subdued, but I have a nose ring. I wore it the whole time I was there. The Board of Education liaison who was helping us made me take it out the first day. We were going to meet our supervisors, but then I put it back in the second day because I was like, that's what we're here for, is to bring your individuality and your own style. Get to your school first. So I didn't put it back until I got to my school and I saw how cool my teachers were going to be and friendly and nice. So wait till you get to your actual placement. I was at one school, you might be at 6, but wait till you get to the specific place you're going to be every day, see how other people are dressed, and even over time make small changes. So there are jets with dyed hair, there are jets with facial piercings, and I have a bunch of tattoos. They were visible. Students asked me questions about it. It was no problem. So get there first, see what the culture is like, but also still be yourself, but keep that business professional in mind. All of that working together. Yeah.
And like, as far as brands, pretty much anything is okay as long as you look business professional. But I will tell you right now, you can never go wrong with Uniqlo or GU. Pretty much anything you get from there will be okay. But it's really up to you.
One more thing, we don't have, Japan doesn't have like a brand culture, right? There's even like people will have on t-shirts and stuff with English words like curse words or like slurs or things like that because they don't know the meaning. So there's not like a brand culture that we have in America, like that brand is bad or that brand is athletic wear, like Nike should only be worn when you're working out. There's not like brand culture there.
Yeah, I guess just to kind of piggyback off of that, I think that you don't really have to worry too much about wearing, foreign brands. If anything, wearing foreign brands is often kind of a status symbol in Japan because they don't have a space for huge houses. They wear really expensive foreign brands as, sort of a status symbol there. So if anything, you'll look really cool. But yeah, again, try not to wear super revealing clothing, which might be a different definition here. It's kind of flipped. Here in the US, I feel like super short skirts and short shorts are considered a little bit risque, but in Japan, the upper body is a much more sexual, like even for me as a man, this would be way too much to have on in Japan. Like I would have to button this up if I were out and about in Japan. And shoulders is a big no-no, visible shoulders. And I would also, obviously at work, but even if you are if you're placed in a smaller area, even when you're not on the clock, people are going to be watching you. And if you're wearing spaghetti straps at the supermarket, word will get back to your school. So, always kind of operate on the assumption that someone is watching you because they probably are. And I just think of it as a uniform. It can be tough, especially in the summer when it's really, really hot and you have to put that cardigan on over you. But, if you were working for a company in the US and they had a uniform, you'd wear that. If you're working for a Japanese government, you need to wear their uniform as well. So I would say one of the greatest resources you can have is if you have a predecessor, talk to them and ask them what the dress code is like at school. It tends to be much more relaxed for elementary. If you are, a gentleman, it's probably going to be suit and ties. It's pretty cut and dry. I think that there are ways to kind of follow the rules while still expressing your individuality, because like Gabrielle said, we're here to be different. We're here to be a little bit, outside the box. So I always had a suit and tie, but sometimes I had like, a hot pink tie, or I would wear like bright purple socks. And I actually think that can be kind of nice because it's a way to show your personality. It gives your students some ammunition, and then the whole way they're like, oh, purple socks. And then that's sort of an in for them to start talking to you. So don't be afraid to sort of to express yourself while still following the rules, and you'll find the ways to do that. But I would say talking to your predecessor if you have one and other jets in your area is a great way to kind of learn what is expected of you as far as dress code goes.
All the above, and like Constance said in the chat, don't wear a black tie, man or women or anybody in between, because it means funeral. Unless you're going to a funeral, if you wear a black tie at work, they'll be like, who died? So yeah, don't wear a black tie. But just to add on with the spouse and partner, again, I don't want to say that Japanese people are immature, because again, it's a different country. So like if I was at work in my corporate offices and someone came up to me after saying, nice to meet you, Espinosa Sensei, and then said, do you have a boyfriend? I'd be like, what? Like, that's so rude and so immature. Are we in junior high school? But in Japan, it is pretty typical. So you might be asked that right away. And if you don't appear to be of a certain gender, maybe they might assume you differently. Or if, like, let's say you go over with a spouse and children, you could be like, use your Jiko Shokai to show your spouse and your children, et cetera, et cetera. But you might get people being like, and they might make comments on your spouse. And again, like we were saying earlier, Japanese people and Japanese culture tends to have different comments that are allowed or not. I didn't go over there with a spouse, but I definitely had people try to, because I was of Japanese descent, they were like, oh, you're a good foreigner. I want to, like, they would try to match make me. And I'm like, no, thank you. No, thank you. I would still do that if that happened in the office. You still have like some of the office politics and drama, but you may not be privy to it, not just because there's a language barrier, but also because you are different. You might have great teachers who include you in everything, or teachers that keep that boundary up, but take it as a blessing. Sometimes you can do your own thing, but having a spouse and partner, share it openly and widely. But again, like, be a good judge of when to do it. Don't like smack everyone in the face with like your picture of your spouse, but don't be surprised if people come out there and just ask you a lot of personal questions about that. And it's okay to say, no, thank you. I don't know. I don't know. That was a good tackle. Like, I don't know what kind of night. Like, that's kansai ben, so don't say that's your that's the more saying like okarimasen. I don't know. Sorry, don't know. Like, play silly if you want. I don't want to say dumb, but like, just say I don't know. No, or I'll be like, they're like, do you have a girlfriend? I'm like, no, do you have a girlfriend? And they would get embarrassed. So yeah, it's, when it comes to that, it's a different way to process personal questions. I don't want to say it's maturity or immaturity, because it's typical questions there.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have for questions, but can we give our panelists a very silent round of applause? Thank them for coming out and talking to all of us and dedicating their Friday, just giving us wonderful advice. We truly appreciate it.